Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mysterious Murmurs. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1, Endless Train Ride. Mark leaned against the cold metal pole at the subway platform, exhaustion etched into every fiber of his being. It had been a grueling day at work, one of those days that seemed to stretch infinitely, where every minute felt like an hour. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, and the last train of the night screeched into the station. The air was thick with the metallic tang of ozone, mingling with the faint, acrid scent of burnt rubber. Overhead, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting long, flickering shadows across the platform. The distant sound of dripping water echoed through the cavernous space, each drop amplifying the oppressive silence. Somewhere far off, a faint, ghostly wind whistled through the tunnels, sending a chill down Mark's spine. Its fluorescent lights flickered ominously as the doors slid open with a mechanical hiss. The carriage was nearly empty. Mark stepped in and scanned the rows of seats. At the far end, a man sat hunched over, his tattered suit hanging loosely on his thin frame. His face was obscured by the shadow of a low-hanging hat, but something about him felt off. Mark shrugged it off as fatigue playing tricks on his mind, and chose a seat closer to the middle of the car. The train jolted forward, and Mark rested his head against the window. He planned to close his eyes for just a moment, but the rhythmic clatter of the wheels kept him awake. As the train sped through the underground labyrinth, Mark noticed something strange. The stations they passed weren't the ones he recognized. Instead of familiar stops like Broadway or Lexington, the signs bore unfamiliar names: Ebon Hollow, Midnight Crossings, and Wraith's End. The letters seemed to pulse with a sinister glow, their shapes twisting like ghostly shadows in the dim light. Each name carried a weight that pressed on Mark's chest, as though the very air around him grew heavier with each passing station. Names whispered of forgotten places where the living dared not tread and the dead roamed free. The letters glowed faintly, their eerie luminescence piercing through the foggy glass. Mark's stomach nodded. He pulled out his phone to check the GPS, but there was no signal. The screen displayed a spinning wheel of frustration, and the battery drained faster than seemed possible. A creeping sense of unease began to settle over him. Finally, unable to ignore the growing dread, Mark stood and approached the man in the tattered suit. "Excuse me," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Do you know where this train is headed?" The man's head turned slowly, as if the effort was monumental, his movements deliberate and unnervingly stiff, like a marionette controlled by unseen strings. As he turned, the dim light revealed more of his features: sunken cheeks clinging desperately to bone, lips cracked and peeling, and eyes that gleamed with an unnatural predatory light. Each motion seemed to stretch time, the air growing heavier with an unspoken menace. When he spoke, his voice was low and gravelly, like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "This train doesn't stop for the living." Mark's heart skipped a beat. What does that mean?" he stammered, but the man didn't answer. Instead, he leaned back, his face emerging from the shadows, recoiled. The man's features were sunken and pallid, his eyes like twin abysses. As the train's lights flickered, his skin seemed to ripple and decay, revealing patches of bone beneath. Panic surged through Mark. He ran to the nearest door and yanked at the emergency handle, but it wouldn't budge. The train's windows offered no solace. Outside, the world had dissolved into an endless dark tunnel. Mark's reflection stared back at him, wide-eyed and pale. His mind raced, questioning the surreal events unfolding around him. Was he losing his grip on reality? He thought of his sister's warm laugh, the aroma of coffee on Sunday mornings, the steady hum of the city outside his apartment window. Normal, comforting things that felt galaxies away. The more he tried to ground himself in those memories, the more the horror of the present clawed at him, pulling him deeper into despair. The man's skeletal grin widened as he stood and began to shuffle toward Mark. "Your stop is next," he rasped, his voice echoing unnaturally in the confined space. Mark's mind raced. Was this a nightmare? A hallucination? He pinched his arm hard enough to leave a mark, but the scene remained horrifyingly real. The air grew colder with each passing second, and the overhead lights dimmed until only the faint glow of the man's decaying visage remained. Desperation took over. Mark ran from car to car, searching for an escape or another passenger, but each carriage was identical. Empty seats, flickering lights, and silence broken only by the rhythmic clatter of the train. He stumbled into the last car and froze. The man was there waiting, his skeletal grin as wide as ever. "There's no running," the man said, his voice a chilling whisper. "The living must leave their mark." Mark backed away, his hand clutching the train pole for support. "I don't belong here," he shouted. "I'm alive." The man tilted his head as if considering the statement. "Alive," he repeated, the word dripping with disdain. "Then why are you here?" Mark opened his mouth to respond, but found he had no answer. He couldn't remember boarding the train. His last clear memory was leaving the office, stepping into the cool night air, and then what? His mind was a foggy abyss. The train began to slow, its screeching brakes reverberating through the car. Mark peered out the window, his breath hitching. The station ahead was unlike any he'd ever seen. Jagged pillars of black stone jutted from the ground, and spectral figures drifted aimlessly through the shadows. The sign overhead read "Final Crossing," in letters that seemed to shift and writhe like living things. The man in the tattered suit gestured toward the doors, which slid open with a haunting hiss. "Your stop," he said. Mark shook his head, stepping back. "No, I'm not getting off." The man's skeletal grin widened impossibly. "You don't have a choice." Invisible hands gripped Mark, pulling him toward the exit. He struggled, but his strength was no match for the unseen force. As he crossed the threshold, the spectral figures turned toward him, their hollow eyes glowing faintly. A chorus of whispers rose around him, a symphony of sorrow and despair. Mark fell to his knees on the cold, unyielding ground. He looked up and found himself surrounded by gravestones, their inscriptions worn and indecipherable. The train was gone, vanished as if it had never existed. In his hand he clutched a crumpled ticket. The ink was smudged, but one detail stood out: the date. Today's date. Tears streamed down Mark's face as the reality of his situation set in. He was in a graveyard, the final stop on an endless train ride. The whispers grew louder, enveloping him in a shroud of despair. And then, as suddenly as they had begun, they stopped. Mark woke with a start, his body drenched in sweat. The whispers from the graveyard still echoed faintly in his ears, like distant cries carried on a cold wind. For a moment he lay motionless, the icy chill of the graveyard clinging to his skin despite the warm sunlight streaming through the window. His heart pounded as he glanced around, reassuring himself that he was indeed in his room. Yet, as his gaze fell on the nightstand, the sight of the crumpled train ticket made his breath hitch. He could still feel the coarse grit of the graveyard soil on his palms, as if the nightmare had left a tangible mark on him. He was in his bed, the morning sunlight streaming through the window. For a brief, blissful moment, he thought it had all been a dream. But when he rolled over, he saw it. The crumpled train ticket on his nightstand, marked with today's date. Story 2, The Silent Carnival. It was a crisp autumn evening when Caleb first noticed the carnival. He had been walking home from the local diner, the night sky painted with hues of orange and purple as the sun dipped below the horizon. The town of Willow Creek, small and seemingly insignificant, had always been quiet, but tonight, something about the atmosphere felt different. As he walked down the main road, he caught a glimpse of vibrant colors in the distance, a blur of reds, yellows, and greens, flickering like fireflies in the distance. He hadn't seen anything like it before, and for some reason, despite the eerie quiet of the evening, Caleb felt an inexplicable pull toward the carnival that had appeared overnight. By the time he reached the field, the carnival was fully set up. The tents stood tall against the horizon, their stripes fluttering in the wind. The Ferris wheel loomed in the background, and the flashing lights of various rides blinked in an unsettling rhythm. There was no sound, no carnival music, no children laughing or calling out to their parents, no vendors shouting their catchphrases, just silence, broken only by the faint rustling of the wind through the leaves. Caleb's curiosity outweighed his unease. The carnival was an oddity, something new, something out of place, and Caleb couldn't resist the urge to explore. It was too bizarre to pass up. There had been no announcements, no news, and certainly no one had mentioned the carnival coming to town. It felt like it appeared out of nowhere, like a figment of imagination made real. As Caleb approached the entrance, he noticed that the gates were wide open. The lack of any attendants or signs made the place feel abandoned, but still, the carnival beckoned him. He hesitated for a moment, the hair on the back of his neck prickling with unease. Something was wrong here, but he shrugged it off. He was just overthinking things. People often spoke of things like this when they encountered the unfamiliar. There was no harm in taking a look. He stepped through the gates, his boots crunching on the gravel path as he ventured deeper into the grounds. The carnival sprawled before him in a confusing tangle of brightly colored tents, stalls, and ride structures, but it was strangely quiet. The rides, though mechanical, moved on their own. The Ferris wheel turned slowly and steadily, creaking with each rotation, while the bumper cars bumped into each other with no one in the seats. The carousel spun lazily, the wooden horses bobbing up and down as though ridden by invisible riders. Caleb's senses were overwhelmed by the surreal scene. He approached the first stall he saw, a ring toss game that was eerily unattended. Prizes, stuffed animals and trinkets, sat neatly arranged on the counter, waiting for someone to claim them. Caleb scanned the stall, wondering if anyone would appear to operate the game, but there was only silence. A chill settled in his chest. Against his better judgment, Caleb decided to try his hand at the game. He picked up a ring and tossed it toward the bottles arranged on the counter. To his surprise, he made the perfect throw. The ring landed neatly around one of the bottles. A mechanical noise clicked from somewhere within the stall, and a stuffed bear, a small scruffy thing, was released into the prize slot. Caleb was taken aback by the ease of his success, but a sense of accomplishment quickly replaced the unease. He reached for the bear and noticed something unsettling. The bear's button eyes, dark and lifeless, seemed to glimmer in the dim light. He took the bear in his hands, feeling its coarse fabric. There was something off about the toy, something unnatural. He could swear its eyes were watching him. Slowly his fingers brushed over the buttons, and then, as if on cue, they blinked. His heart skipped a beat. The bear's eyes moved, like they were alive. Caleb's breath caught in his throat, and he nearly dropped the toy in shock. He stepped back, his heart pounding in his chest, but the bear remained perfectly still, as though nothing had happened. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the feeling creeping up his spine. It had to be a trick of the light, a figment of his overactive imagination. He turned on his heel, preparing to leave the stall and move deeper into the carnival. but something stopped him. The path he had come from, the one that led back to the entrance, no longer seemed to exist. He took a step forward and found himself standing at the same spot again, as if no time had passed. The Ferris wheel loomed before him in the distance, the sound of its creaking and groaning now louder, more prominent. The bumper cars continued to crash into each other, their movements erratic and mechanical. He looked around, confusion seeping into his mind. How could he have gotten back here so quickly? It was as though the carnival had no end, no beginning. It was just a loop. Panic began to rise in his chest. He looked to the nearest exit and saw the same sprawling rows of tents and rides in the distance. No matter which way he turned, he was stuck in the same place, like a fly caught in a web. The more he tried to escape, the deeper he was pulled into the maze. A sense of dread began to settle over him, the atmosphere growing heavier with each passing moment. His footsteps quickened, his mind racing. What was happening? Why couldn't he leave? Then, as if to answer his question, a voice whispered in the air, cold and haunting, "You're part of the show now." Caleb froze, the hairs on his neck standing up. He whipped around, trying to locate the source of the voice, but there was no one there. The carnival remained as empty as ever. No workers, no visitors, just the relentless movement of the rides and the suffocating silence. "Who's there?" he called, his voice shaking. "What do you mean, part of the show?" The only answer was the creaking of the Ferris wheel, its lights flickering as if the very structure of the carnival was alive, watching him. His pulse quickened, and his mind raced to make sense of it all. Was this some kind of elaborate prank? But the longer he stayed, the more the carnival seemed to twist and warp. He stumbled backward, his foot catching on something, and when he looked down, he saw the stuffed bear lying at his feet. The button eyes blinked again, stomach churned. He grabbed the bear, throwing it aside, and turned to run. But no matter which direction he sprinted, he ended up back at the same spot. Every path seemed to lead him to the ticket booth. The same booth where the mannequin stood, frozen in place. Caleb's breath caught in his throat as he approached the booth. The mannequin behind the counter, an exact replica of him, stared back, its button eyes glinting under the dim light. It was dressed in his own clothes, the same jeans, the same jacket, the same shoes. He reached out toward the mannequin, his hand trembling as he touched the glass. And in that moment something shifted. The mannequin's eyes blinked. It smiled, its lips curling into a grotesque, impossibly wide grin. A scream rose in Caleb's throat, but before he could release it, everything around him went black. Next morning, the town of Willow Creek was calm and still. The carnival was gone, vanished without a trace. There were no tents, no rides, no flashing lights. The only remnants of the strange event were the whispers of the townspeople who had awoken to an empty field. And in the ticket booth, where Caleb had stood the night before, there was a new mannequin. It was dressed in clothes eerily similar to Caleb's own. Its button eyes blinked once, slowly, as though it knew the secret of the carnival's twisted magic. The carnival had claimed another soul, and in the distance, on the wind, a whisper echoed, "You're part of the show now. Story 3, The Forgotten Tunnel." Mia and her friends had always been drawn to the thrill of the unknown. They often found themselves exploring the outskirts of their small town, looking for abandoned places and forgotten corners of the world that the townspeople had long since abandoned. They were a tight-knit group, Mia, her best friend Sarah, and two of their close friends, Mark and Jason. Every weekend they would meet up and wander through the woods or roam the old crumbling parts of town, always seeking the next mystery to unravel. One chilly afternoon, as the sun began to set and the sky turned a soft pink, the group ventured beyond the outskirts of town. They had heard rumors about an old railway tunnel, a long-forgotten remnant of the past that stretched deep under the earth. It was said to be haunted, and many people in town had sworn to have seen strange things around it. Glowing lights, shadows moving in the dark, and eerie sounds that seemed to come from nowhere. "Sounds perfect for a little adventure, doesn't it?" Mark said, grinning as he stuffed his hands into his jacket pockets. He had always been the most daring of the group, always ready to challenge the strange and unexplained. Mia, always up for an adventure, nodded eagerly. "It's probably just an old tunnel, right? Nothing to worry about. But let's make it fun." The group walked through the woods, the trees growing denser as they ventured farther from town. The air had a crisp, cool bite to it, and the crunch of their boots on the leaves was the only sound that broke the silence. Sunlight grew dimmer as they made their way to the tunnel's location, and when they finally arrived, it felt like they had crossed into another world. The entrance to the tunnel was covered in thick layers of graffiti. Bright, bold colors scrawled over the rusting steel walls of the tunnel's opening. But one thing stood out among the chaotic designs. A message spray-painted in large slashing letters that read, "Do not enter." Beneath it, someone had scribbled a warning in smaller text, "They never leave." Mia felt a shiver run down her spine as she gazed at the message. But her friends weren't deterred. "Come on, it's just some graffiti," Sarah said, nudging Mia in the side. "It's probably just kids messing around. We're not going to let some spray paint scare us, are we?" "No way," Mark chimed in. "We're explorers, right? We'll be fine." Jason, who had been quiet up until now, glanced at the tunnel entrance, his expression unreadable. "I don't know, guys. Something about this feels wrong." "Stop being such a scaredy cat," Mia teased him, giving him a playful shove. "We're in this together." With a collective shrug, the group decided to venture inside, their laughter echoing as they crossed the threshold of the tunnel. It was much darker than they had anticipated. The narrow opening led into a tunnel that stretched far deeper than they could see, and the air grew thicker with each step. The scent of rust and decay lingered in the damp, musty atmosphere, and the sound of their footsteps reverberated off the cold stone walls. Mia flicked on her flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness ahead. The group followed her closely, their voices growing softer as they moved deeper into the tunnel. Faint rustling of their movements seemed to disturb the silence, making it feel even more eerie. The temperature dropped suddenly, as though they had stepped into a different world. Mia wrapped her arms around herself, trying to ward off the cold, but it seemed to seep into her bones, making her shiver. Her breath came out in visible puffs as she turned back to her friends. "Did it just get a lot colder?" Sarah asked, pulling her jacket tighter around herself. "It's the tunnel," Mark said with a dismissive wave. "It's old. It's bound to be colder down here." But Mia couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The deeper they walked, the more unsettling it became. The air felt heavier, as though it had been trapped here for years, never able to escape. And then faintly, almost imperceptibly, Mia thought she heard a whisper. At first, she thought it was just the wind or the creaking of the tunnel itself, but then the voice called her name, Mia. It was barely audible, just a soft murmur, but the chill that washed over her made her freeze in place. She glanced at her friends, but they didn't seem to have heard it. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. "Hear what?" Sarah asked, looking confused. "You're freaking out. It's just the wind." Mia wasn't so sure. She felt her heartbeat quicken, her eyes scanning the dark shadows of the tunnel around them. The whisper came again, clearer this time, and it was followed by more whispers, voices soft but distinct, calling each of them by name. Sarah, Jason, her friends heard it too now. They all paused, looking around nervously. The air felt charged, as though something was watching them. But there was nothing, just the echo of their voices and the low hum of the tunnel. "Let's turn back," Jason suggested, his voice tight. "This is getting weird." But before anyone could respond, the ground beneath them seemed to vibrate. A low hum reverberated through the walls, and the faint sound of metal creaking filled the air. The tunnel seemed to come alive, the vibrations intensifying as they moved forward. The beam of Mia's flashlight landed on something unexpected. At the end of the tunnel, the tracks that once served the trains lay exposed, rusting and forgotten. But something about them felt different. They were humming with an eerie energy, as though the tracks themselves were alive, pulsing with a strange force. Suddenly, the sound of a train horn blared, deafeningly loud, echoing through the tunnel. It was so sharp and sudden that it made all of them jump back in alarm. The horn wasn't the only thing that came with it. A massive spectral locomotive materialized out of the darkness, charging toward them with incredible speed. Its lights blazed through the tunnel, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. The train was nothing like any they had ever seen. Its sleek, metallic surface shimmered with an ethereal glow, and the sound of its horn shook the very foundation of the tunnel. Panic surged through Mia's veins as the train hurtled closer. "Run!" she screamed, and the group turned on their heels, sprinting back the way they came. But as they ran, Mia's foot caught on an old rail, and she stumbled, falling hard to the ground. Her flashlight flew from her hand, rolling away into the darkness. She scrambled to get up, but by the time she regained her footing, her friends were gone. She called out for them, but there was no response. She rushed forward, her heart pounding in her chest, but when she reached the tunnel's exit, her friends were nowhere to be found. The tunnel was empty. Her friends had disappeared, as though swallowed by the earth itself. She called their names, panic rising in her throat, but only silence answered. The only thing left was the faint, distant echo of the train horn, still blaring, still reverberating through the air. Mia looked down at the ground. Her necklace, a silver pendant her grandmother had given her, lay on the cold stone floor, the chain broken. She picked it up, trembling, and a strange sense of dread filled her. She turned back into the tunnel, hoping against hope that her friends were just hiding, playing some cruel prank. But the deeper she went, the more the tunnel seemed to stretch on forever. No sign of them, no trace of their presence. She ran again, but the echoes of the train horn and the whispers grew louder. She couldn't escape them. Next morning, when the search teams came, there was no sign of Mia or her friends. The tunnel was empty, the air still and silent. Only the faintest traces of footsteps remained, leading into the blackness. The townspeople still swear they can hear the train's horn at night, carried on the wind. They say it's the sound of the lost, the souls trapped forever in the forgotten tunnel. And sometimes, if you listen closely, you can hear a whisper, soft and distant, calling your name. Story 4. The Whispers in the Woods. It was late October when Anna and her friends, Jordan, Lisa, and Ben, decided to take one last hike through the woods before the first snowfall. The town of Pine Hollow had always been quiet, its people content to live their simple lives far from the distractions of modern society. The surrounding forest was dense and unwelcoming, its towering trees casting long, shadowy figures as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The friends had spent countless afternoons hiking the familiar trails, but that evening, as the autumn wind rustled through the branches, something felt different. They had heard rumors about the forest, whispers of strange occurrences, tales of people who had gone missing and never returned, and eerie stories about voices heard in the wind. Most dismissed these as old superstitions, but for some reason, Anna couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. "Stop being such a baby," Jordan laughed as he slapped Anna on the back. "We've been through these woods 100 times. There's nothing here." But Anna wasn't so sure. She could feel the weight of the trees around them, their presence suffocating, as if they were more alive than they should be. She tried to ignore the feeling, but it lingered, creeping at the edges of her thoughts. As they reached the end of the trail, a small clearing appeared ahead. In the center of the clearing stood an old stone well, partially overgrown with moss and vines. It was an odd sight. No one in the town had ever mentioned it before, and no one had ever come this far into the woods. "This must be it," Lisa said, her voice almost a whisper. "The old well the locals talk about." Anna turned to face her friends, confused. "What are you talking about?" "I've never heard of it." Ben, always the skeptic, raised an eyebrow. "It's just an old well, nothing more." Anna could tell that they weren't the only ones who felt the strange pull of the place. They all stood there for a long moment, unsure of what to do, as the light from the setting sun began to fade, leaving only the eerie glow of twilight. Jordan took the first step, walking toward the well with an air of confidence. "We should take a look. What's the worst that could happen?" Against her better judgment, Anna followed him. She hesitated for a moment, feeling as though the forest was closing in on them. It was almost as if the trees were watching, listening, waiting for something to happen. Ben followed close behind, muttering under his breath, "I don't know about this, guys. Feels like we're trespassing on something wrong." "Relax," Lisa said, laughing nervously. "It's just an old well. No big deal." As they gathered around the well, Anna couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was an unsettling stillness in the air. The wind had stopped, and even the animals had fallen silent. It was as though the forest had gone into a kind of suspended animation, waiting for something to happen. Jordan leaned over the edge of the well, peering into the dark depths below. "Nothing here," he said, his voice echoing strangely in the quiet. "Just some old water, maybe a few rocks." Anna, however, couldn't help but notice something at the bottom of the well. There was someone down there. It was hard to make out at first, but then, just as the last light of day disappeared beyond the horizon, she saw it clearly. A pale face, eyes wide open, staring up at them from the depths. Anna gasped and stumbled back. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice shaking. The others turned toward her, their faces filled with confusion. "See what?" Lisa asked, her voice calm and casual. Anna shook her head, still reeling from what she had seen. "There was someone down there, watching us." Jordan laughed, though it was a nervous sound. "You've had too much of that wild berry tea, Anna. It's just your mind playing tricks on you." But Anna couldn't let it go. There was no mistaking what she had seen. The eyes had been unmistakable, wide, lifeless, and full of terror. Something was down there, something that had been trapped for far too long. Suddenly, the wind picked up again, howling through the trees with a sudden ferocity that made them all flinch. Leaves swirled around them, and the trees creaked as if something massive was moving through the forest. Then, from the direction of the well, came a faint whisper. It was soft at first, like a distant murmur, but it grew louder, growing more insistent. The voice was low and guttural, like something that had not spoken in years. The words were indistinct, but Anna could swear she heard her name mixed in with the eerie murmur. "Anna," the whisper called again, sending chills down her spine. She glanced around at her friends, but they hadn't heard it. They were still fixated on the well, oblivious to the strange presence that had awakened in the woods. "Did you hear that?" Anna whispered, her voice trembling. "Hear what?" Ben replied, looking confused. There's someone, calling my name, Anna said, her voice low and frantic. Lisa rolled her eyes. Anna, you're imagining things. We're just tired, that's all. Before Anna could respond, the whisper came again, louder this time. Anna, help. Her heart skipped a beat as the voice seemed to come from within the well. She took a cautious step forward, compelled by something she couldn't explain. The others remained behind, their voices fading into the wind as Anna's focus narrowed on the dark hole in the ground. As she leaned over the edge, she felt a cold, clammy hand grasp her wrist. It was icy to the touch, and the grip was so strong it felt as though it could pull her into the depths of the well. She screamed, trying to pull away, but the hand tightened its hold. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she fought against the invisible force. Anna! Jordan shouted, rushing forward, but he was too late. The grip on her wrist yanked her down, and in a split second, she was falling. She tumbled into darkness, her body spinning as she fell further and further into the well. The sound of the wind, the voices, everything faded into nothingness. Then all at once it stopped. Anna found herself lying in a cold, damp space. Her heart raced as she sat up, looking around. The walls of the well had opened into a vast underground chamber, its floor covered in moss and old crumbled bones. The air was thick with an oppressive silence. And then she heard the whisper again, this time louder, clearer. Welcome to the forgotten ones. Anna turned slowly, her heart sinking as she saw the figure in the corner of the chamber. It was a man, or at least it had been once. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were wide open, fixed on her with a gaze that was both vacant and pleading. The whisper came again, "You're not alone here." Suddenly, Anna realized the truth. The well had never been abandoned. It had been a prison, holding something ancient, something that had been waiting for years to be freed. As her friends continued to search the woods above, calling her name, Anna felt herself being drawn deeper into the shadows. The whispers around her grew louder, joining together into a chorus of voices, calling to her, pleading with her, and in the distance, the wind howled through the trees. The next day, the searchers found no trace of Anna or her friends. The well, however, stood undisturbed, a silent monument to the darkness that lay beneath. Some say, if you listen closely on quiet nights, you can still hear Anna's voice calling for help, lost forever in the whispers of the woods. Story 5, The Hollow Tree. It was the beginning of fall when Ethan, his younger sister Lily, and their two childhood friends, Sam and Emma, decided to take one last hike before the first frost settled in. The small town of Westwood was surrounded by thick forests, its rich green canopy a sight to behold during the warmer months. But come autumn, the trees began to shed their leaves, exposing the bare skeletons of what had once been vibrant life. There was a strange, almost suffocating quiet that overtook the woods, and something about that silence always unsettled Ethan. Still, he wasn't about to let that stop the group from their tradition of exploring the woods during the changing seasons. "Let's head to the hollow tree," Sam suggested with a grin as the group gathered at the base of the forest's entrance. "You know, the one by the creek." Emma, always eager for an adventure, nodded enthusiastically. "I've heard that tree is older than the town. Imagine the stories it could tell if it could talk." Lily, who was only 14, seemed more hesitant, but Ethan reassured her with a smile. "It's just a big old tree, Lils. Nothing to worry about." The hollow tree was an ancient oak that had stood in the forest for as long as anyone could remember. Its trunk was enormous, hollowed out with age, and the gaping mouth of the hollow had become a place for curious hikers to leave trinkets or to carve their initials. The locals didn't think much of it, aside from the fact that it had an odd, almost eerie presence that some found unsettling. Groups set off down the familiar trail, their boots crunching over the dry leaves that littered the ground. The deeper they ventured, the quieter the forest became. No birds, no rustling animals, just the rhythmic sound of their footsteps and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. It wasn't long before they reached the creek. The water, though flowing, looked dark and sluggish, as if it too had grown tired of the summer's warmth. "There it is," Ethan said, pointing to the enormous oak tree standing like a sentinel against the sky. The hollow tree was even more imposing in the dimming light of evening, its gnarled branches twisting like dark fingers against the fading sun. The hollow within its trunk was deep, and the scent of damp earth and age filled the air around it. The tree's bark had a rough texture, and the weathered, twisting roots seemed to disappear into the ground, almost as though they were reaching for something beneath the surface. "Spooky, isn't it?" Lily whispered, clutching her brother's arm. "Don't be a baby," Sam teased, pulling Lily away from Ethan. "It's just a tree." But even Sam couldn't help but look around, his eyes scanning the forest as though he, too, sensed something was off. Emma, ever the optimist, moved toward the tree and began inspecting the hollow, her fingers lightly tracing the edges. "It's just a big old tree," Emma said, more to herself than to anyone else. But her voice, despite her cheerful tone, seemed to falter. "Something's weird about it, though, like it's watching us." Lily giggled nervously. "You're just messing with us, right?" "Oh, seriously, I don't like it," Emma said, her eyes flicking toward the shadows around the tree. There was something unsettling about the way the forest seemed to close in around them, the trees looming taller now that the daylight was fading. Ethan frowned, feeling the weight of the silence press in on them. "Let's just take a quick look inside and head back before it gets dark. I don't want to get stuck out here after dark." The group moved closer to the hollow, and Ethan felt a strange chill in the air, one that had nothing to do with the changing seasons. The ground beneath his feet seemed to shift slightly, and when he bent to peer into the hollow, he noticed something strange. Inside the tree at the very bottom was a pile of old, withered bones. That's not right," Ethan muttered, his stomach twisting. "Maybe animals died there," Sam suggested dismissively, though his voice lacked its usual bravado. He was staring into the hollow, too, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. Emma reached into the hollow with a trembling hand, brushing the pile of bones aside. Beneath them, something glimmered in the low light. "What is that?" she whispered, pulling out a small weathered metal box. It was rusted, but intricate in design, with strange symbols carved into its surface. Emma's fingers lingered over the symbols as she traced them lightly. "Put it down, Em," Lily said, her voice tense. "We shouldn't be messing with that." But Emma, her curiosity piqued, opened the box. Inside was a small, faded piece of parchment. She held it up, reading aloud. "The hollow tree holds what you seek, but it shall never let you leave." Words sent a shiver down their spines. There was a long pause, the silence stretching on until it was broken by a rustling sound in the trees behind them. Everyone froze, turning toward the noise. "Did you hear that?" Sam asked, his voice low and shaky. The wind had died down, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. Then, faintly, a voice, soft, distant, whispered from the darkness behind them, "Leave now." It was a low, rasping voice, and it seemed to come from all directions at once. The hairs on the back of Ethan's neck stood on end, and he immediately grabbed Lily's arm, pulling her away from the tree. "We need to go now," he said urgently. But as they turned to leave, the path behind them had changed. The familiar creek was no longer visible. In fact, there was no path at all. Only dense, dark forest surrounded them. The trees were unnaturally close, their branches curling in toward the center, creating an almost suffocating barrier. Ethan's heart raced as he spun around, trying to make sense of what was happening. He looked back at the tree, and to his horror, the hollow had deepened, as if the tree itself was alive, expanding. The wind picked up again, but this time it carried with it the faint whispers of dozens of voices, calling to them from the depths of the woods. "Leave, don't stay. Why did you wake us?" Suddenly the ground beneath them trembled. The tree's roots began to stir, lifting from the earth like monstrous tendrils. The hollow in the tree grew wider, and within its depths dark shapes moved, flickering in and out of view. Eyes, countless eyes, glared at them from within the trunk. Ethan felt his knees weaken, and he heard Sam shout, "Run! Run!" But the forest itself seemed to close in on them. The trees shifted, blocking their path, pushing them further into the forest. They ran blindly, their breaths quick and panicked, but it was as though the woods had become a maze, each turn leading them deeper into darkness. In a desperate attempt to escape, Ethan grabbed Lily's hand and pulled her along, but the whispers continued to grow louder, more frantic. The ground seemed to shift beneath their feet, the trees closing in on them with each step. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, everything stopped. Woods were silent again, eerily so. Ethan stopped, panting for breath, his eyes wide with fear. They were standing at the edge of the clearing again, the hollow tree looming before them, as though nothing had ever happened. But the metal box was gone. The bones were no longer there. The symbols on the tree were different now, darker, twisted. "Let's never speak of this again," Emma said, her voice shaking. And as they turned to leave, the whispers followed them, soft and persistent, fading into the distance. Not all who enter the hollow tree leave. If you've enjoyed this journey into the unknown, don't forget to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have a tale of your own or a legend you'd like us to explore? Let us know. You might just hear it next. Be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. Because here, the darkness is always waiting, just for you.